Our text today, as we consider what it means to live with intention, is the Gospel of Thomas. Here's the story of that elusive gospel. And lo, it came to pass that among the plethora of apocalyptic preachers walking the hills of Palestine, there was one who stood out. He was enigmatic, witty, and compassionate to the most unlikely people. He didn't suffer fools gladly and wasn't afraid to speak the truth to power. People started paying attention to what he was saying, even going out of their way to hear him. Now, in those days, the people suffered from a significant lack of digital recording equipment. They had to actually remember what he said. They did the best they could. They told other people, some even jotted down some notes. Unfortunately, this man didn't last long in the politically charged atmosphere of the times, but after his death at the hands of the authorities, the people who had listened to him most carefully tried to hold on to what he had said. Remember that time they would say to each other when he stood on the plane and gave that great stump speech? Long before there were gospel stories about virgin births and empty tombs, there were written records of the words this man spoke, or so scholars think. But then a decree went out that all the so-called Christians had to agree on only one set of stories. All over the known world, Christian communities that had loved and been faithful to other evangelists, Thomas notable among them, had to destroy their records and affirm their loyalty to the new authorities. How ironic is it that in just a few generations, the followers of the man who was put to death for speaking the truth to power became the people that exercised power to put to death those who disagreed with them. In a monastery in Upper Egypt named after Saint Pachomius, monks placed their condemned writings in a clay jar and buried them, hoping that when the danger passed, they could go back and reclaim them. Now, they did not live to see that day, and eventually the location of the jar was lost to the ages. Nearly 2 millennia later, in December of 1945, an Arab peasant digging for fertilizer in the hills outside the village of Nag Hammadi found a clay jar stuffed with old papyrus leaves and books. He brought it home, having no idea of the origin or worth of the contents. Legend says that his mom used some of the papers to dry dishes. Eventually, through a convoluted and somewhat illegal process, the books fell into the hands of biblical scholars who were amazed to discover one manuscript that began, "These are the secret words which the living Jesus spoke and which the twin Judas Thomas wrote down." It was the Gospel of Thomas. Now, the Thomas Christians were one of many groups of early Jesus followers. Their community was in what is now Syria, and though it is unlikely that their founder was really the Apostle Thomas, they claimed apostolic succession through him. The Thomas brand of Christianity was distinctive due to two major influences, Eastern Buddhism and Gnosticism. Thomas was said to have gone to India to evangelize, and there are Christian communities in India even today who trace their history back to the first century of the Common Era. But the religious influence seemed to have worked both ways. Evangelists, Christian evangelists who returned from India brought with them some of the beliefs and practices of Buddhism, which found their way into the spirituality of the Thomas community. This is Thomas, verse 18, for example. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us how our end will be." And Jesus said, "Have you discovered then the beginning that you look for the end? For where the beginning is, there will the end be. Blessed is he who will take his place in the beginning. He will know the end and will not experience death." That's a pretty Zen-like koan, is it not? The other influence in the Gospel of Thomas is Gnosticism, which is a form of Greek mysticism. The word gnosis, and that's Gnosis, translates as the act of knowing, a process that brings insight. This act of knowing is personal and experiential. Gnosis does not come from facts or imperial reason. It is based on intuition and perception. It reminds me of the first source of authority identified in the Unitarian Universalist Statement of Principles and Purposes, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. The Gospel of Thomas assumes that religious truth is something that each person arrives at on their own. Thomas, verse 3. And Jesus said, if those who lead you say to you, see, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are the poverty. That sounds kind of you to me. Gnostic Christians were excluded from the early church, at least partly because their assumption about the nature of religious truth was anti-patriarchal. Some of the Gnostics were women, and anti-authoritarian. If the truth is within each individual, and if every person must find their own spiritual path to that truth, then there is little value in the authority of an ordained priest or a creed or an official set of doctrines. Furthermore, the Gnostics believed that salvation was a this-worldly rather than an otherworldly experience. They strove for enlightenment and reunification with the divine source in this life. They weren't waiting to get into heaven. Thomas, verse 24, said, his disciples said to him, show us the place where you are, since it is necessary for us to seek it. And he said to them, whoever has ears, let him hear. There is a light within a man of light, and he lights up the whole world. If he does not shine, he is darkness. In other words, to know oneself in the Gnostic sense is also to know the divine. Trudy, I want to point out that there are some people in the waiting room. It keeps flashing up on my screen. So for the Gnostic Christians, Jesus was not so much a savior as the ultimate spiritual guide. They believed that his primary purpose was to lead people to spiritual understanding rather than to save them from sin. The Gospel of Thomas does not deal with sin or atonement. There is no narrative regarding the crucifixion or resurrection. There is no talk of heaven or hell or salvation. The language is the language of enlightenment. That feels very you to me. Now, not everything in the Gospel of Thomas resonates with contemporary Unitarian Universalist theologies or practices. As with so many sources for our eclectic faith, we find ourselves having to pick and choose. But isn't that what heretics are supposed to do, to choose? Isn't that what the definition of a heretic is? Someone who has chosen out? We sift through diverse sources and we hold on to what resonates with our carefully considered individual experiences and our shared experiences. To put aside that which no longer makes sense as our understanding of the world evolves. See, the theological work of the heretic is never done. And, speaking of heretics, it takes courage to choose out of the accepted cultural norms and assumptions that we are surrounded by. It takes courage to live intentionally when our inner values and principles aren't in sync with the majority. As the humanist psychologist Abraham Maslow said, in any given moment, we have two options: to step forward in growth or to step back into safety. It is so much easier to do that, to step forward courageously into growth when we are in the company of others. That is why living intentionally, at least for most of us, is about choosing an intentional community of faith rather than becoming a hermit and going off into the desert alone to practice our chosen spiritual discipline. And that brings me back to the question of the day, which is, how do we live with intention. What are the spiritual practices that will lead us to know ourselves on a deeper level? Now, the best UU definition of spiritual practice that I know comes from the Reverend Scott Alexander, whose book, Everyday Spiritual Practices, has informed many of us on our spiritual paths. Scott says that anything can be a spiritual practice as long as it is done regularly and with intention. Regularly and intentionally. And I would add, as long as it moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life, as our first source says. So please put aside time for your chosen spiritual practice: contemplation, meditation, prayer, a walk in the woods, listening to music, whatever it is that feeds your soul. Do more of it, and do it regularly and intentionally. Heed well the words of Thomas, who was, if you remember, the most skeptical and doubting of the disciples. Thomas was the disciple who did not believe the resurrection had occurred until he had physical proof. So when he says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. And if you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth, you will destroy you. You would do well to heed his advice. Nurture your inner life, honor your inner wisdom, bring forth that which is within you. Or as the contemporary Quaker Parker Palmer says, before you tell your life what you intend to do with it, listen for what it intends to do with you. Before you tell your life what truths and values you have decided to live up to, let your life tell you what truths you embody and what values you represent. And then be sure to come together regularly to support each other, to care for each other, to learn from each other, to feed each other, and to challenge each other. Because whatever wisdom is not within you is certainly among you and between you. That is the reason for our houses of worship, to make possible the creative and respectful interchange of beliefs and ideas that leads to what we call salvation, which is in this life, in this world, becoming what we are meant to become. Now, when I started working on this sermon, I thought it might be mostly about Ralph Waldo Emerson rather than the Gospel of Thomas. And then I realized that was another sermon. But I do want to close with some words of wisdom from the Gospel of Ralph. He said, a person will worship something, have no doubt about that. We may think our tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it will out. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our lives and our character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship, for what we are worshiping, we are becoming. And so, in our worshiping together, we are becoming together. Let that always be so for this beloved community of faith.